A brief note before we begin. Origins explores the history of drugs in America, and some conversations may include sensitive or controversial subject matters. The views, interpretations, and conclusions expressed by our guests are based on their individual research, professional experience, and perspectives, and do not necessarily reflect the views of Everything Drug and Alcohol, Federal Drug Testing Services, or the host. This series is presented for educational and informational purposes. With that said, let's go back to the beginning. This is Origins, the 5 drugs that changed America. Welcome to Everything Drug and Alcohol. I'm your host, Greg Henderson, and this is Origins, the 5 drugs that changed America, a series where we go beyond the drug tests and the regulations to understand the history behind the substances that ultimately became part of America's federal drug testing landscape. Today, we're exploring opiates and opioids, but this story doesn't begin on a street corner or with a drug cartel. It also runs through doctors' offices, pharmacies, pharmaceutical companies, government policy, race, medicine, and the American marketplace. My guest is David Herzberg, professor and author of White Market Drugs, Big Pharma, and the Hidden Histories of Addiction in America, and also the co-author of Whiteout, How Racial Capitalism Changed the Color of Opioids in America. Together, we're going back to the origins, examining how legitimate medicines became intertwined with addiction, how America came to view different drug users differently, and how decisions made decades ago helped shape the opioids crisis we recognize today. This is Origins, and today we follow the history of opioids and opioids, from medicine to marketplace to crisis. Let's welcome Professor David Herzberg. All right, after the intro, we're here with my guest, David. So welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Welcome to the show. And you're out of Buffalo.
Buffalo, New York.
Is it cold there? It's always cold there.
No, Buffalo has a reputation. I mean, to tell you, for one thing, summers in Buffalo are really nice. And for
Okay.
another thing, all that weather stuff you see on the Weather Channel in the winter, that isn't the city of Buffalo. That is the southern suburbs. The city of Buffalo, the people who founded it, they were pretty smart. They knew where the prevailing winds were. We don't get like 3/4 of those storms
Okay.
here in the city.
So the Lake Erie effect doesn't really
Yeah. Yeah, they get
get to
like
you.
3 times as much snow as us in the southern tier. So yeah, it's a lot less harsh than our reputation is, you know.
Perceive. So I have to ask you this before we get into any of this stuff here, because I'm quite sure that you're gonna make some viewers probably mad at you or whatever. But it depends on your answer though.
Okay.
So are you a Bills fan?
Well, I care about my city, and that means that I want my city to be happy. So I'm a
Right.
Bills fan. And my oldest son was really into the Bills. So we went to see a game, live every year for,
Okay.
15 years or so. So I've seen their best and their worst. And, I'm a basketball guy. I can't feel anything really about football, but I
Okay.
feel something for my city. And this city really loves the Bills. So
They really
yeah,
love the Bills
yeah,
and the Sabres.
they do. Yep, it's true. And when they're both bad, it's sad, it's
Yeah.
there's not, we're a small city, there's not a ton going on, and yeah, I prefer
That's
the
their
people
hope.
to be yeah, I prefer people to be happy. I keep the windows open, I can tell what the score of the game is, just listen. I'm like, oh, that was a near score cheer. Oh, that was a cheer,
Uh,
you know.
So you don't even have to watch the game.
Yeah, I don't like I said, I'm a basketball guy. If I'm gonna watch sports, it's gonna be basketball.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about you. You're a professor, right, at University of Buffalo currently.
That's right. I've been
How
here
long
for
you been a
20
professor?
years.
20 years?
Yeah, 20 years here.
Wow. Okay. So you lined up a lot of courses there. So your official title is what? You're the director of health and society programs at What is your actual title?
Yeah, I'm professor of history, and I'm director of a program that I created called Drugs, Health, and Society. It's an interdisciplinary master's degree program, and I'm also the education director of an institute here called the Clinical and Research Institute on the Addictions, which has been around since the 70s. And I'm the humanities guy. I'm the humanist with a bunch of scientists and clinicians there.
Right. So you have courses like, and I'm looking at my little teleprompter thing here. So you have U.S. history since the Civil War,
Mhm.
drugs and global capitalism, health and illness in American history, alcohol and other drugs in American history, and U.S. historical. Why these topics?
Well, we're a state university, and so I do some general education courses. I do U.S. history since the Civil War because U.S. historians generally split between people who teach before and after the Civil War. So I teach those service courses just for kids coming through, getting their degree in general education requirements. And then because we're a research university, I also have the good fortune to be able to teach in my area of specialty. So while I'm familiar broadly with U.S. history, um, there are areas that where I do my own research and I write books and I get to teach in those areas. And those are alcohol and drug areas. And more broadly, alcohol and drug history is considered to be part of the history of medicine because obviously alcohol and drugs at various times have been used as medicines in the medical system, and also the kind of experiences people have when they use these drugs, even when they're not using them to treat a diagnosed illness. Those are often seen through a medical lens as well, like addiction being a disease, for example. So those are those areas. I teach those courses because those are the ones that I know the most about.
Gotcha. So there was one I did not mention on purpose that is on there because like I was telling you earlier when I was doing my research on who I wanted to bring on, this platform because of my federal audience and all these other things. This course stood out to me because it's more personal to me than any of the other ones. And I was just like, I was taken aback by that, like, how's this on University of Buffalo? It's just like so. And the course is the bad medicine, race, and the Tuskegee syphilis study in from 1932 to 1972 course. Where did that come from?
Well, I was asked to teach, we're a really big university, tens of thousands of people. And so to try to help students when they first come in to have a more tailored experience and not just be thrown in, to the ocean deep end, they have these things called freshman seminars. And we're invited to pick a topic to teach these that it's a course kind of like half how to be a college student and half like introducing you to a particular field and how it pursues knowledge. And so I was interested in questions of race and medicine because I mean I study the history of drugs in the US. This stuff beats you over the head. Like you go out looking for one thing and you're just kind of kidnapped by questions of race and social class and things like this because they matter so much to how the policies play out and people's experiences. And so I wanted to look at something that would allow me to discuss those kinds of issues with students, but that was really contained. Because in this kind of course, you can't have a ton of content because you'd have a whole week that's on like how to organize your time, because this is something that shockingly teenagers are not great at. And so this was a single episode that contained within it all of the infinite complexity of these issues in American history so that we could really look in detail at a kind of a day by day unfolding, get to know all of the people involved, but still talk about things at that higher level of understanding. So what I didn't think of, as I was telling you earlier, was this course launched during the early days of the pandemic when everybody was already freaked out and unhappy. And I was teaching this course that's, this is, as I'm sure you know, like this is a devastating story of cruelty and just kind of the worst sort of racism, this kind of inability to see other humans as full human beings. I just kind of forgot when I was putting it there, thinking all intellectually about this and that, forgetting that it was a really, depressing and topic. Um, but the students really are ready to dig in. There's a lot of complexity to it. It's not, there's no human experience that is just so simple that you can just understand it fully in a sentence or two. Yeah.
Yeah. So the funny thing about it is that I actually was born in Tuskegee,
Yeah.
and I actually went to school in a little town called Notasulga, which is, of
Mm,
course, where the lot of the study took place from, the Notasulga, Alabama, Macon County, town. So I have great great grandparents who,
mm,
participate in that. But however, in my school was literally like probably 3, 4 miles from the cemetery and
mm,
Shiloh, the Shiloh school. They never taught us this in school.
mm,
I never really fully knew about this until I was gone and I was an adult and later on throughout life. But I've never had this study in school, and I'm literally
mm,
down the street from the
mm.
cemetery and the
Wow.
Rosenwald school. Yeah.
So how did find out about it if it wasn't from a class somewhere?
I that's how I found out about it. Then I had to go back and ask questions, you
Or... Mm,
know,
mm,
later on in life. Like my best friend mom was a part of the restoration project for the Rosenwald Elementary School and the
mm,
cemetery, along with Auburn University. Um, so Elizabeth Sims Smith was the one who kind of spearheaded that restoration project for the school, and that's how I really started getting into it because I was helping them be a part of
mm,
this restoration project. And that's how I found out about her great grandfather, who actually is the one that I kind of molded in my book Tuskegee after, the love story of a couple
mm.
that went through that actual process. So when I saw this on your site, I said, "Oh, I got to get him on, even if it's just to begin navigating." Um, so yeah, was there a personal moment or experience that made you realize this topic needed its own dedicated space?
Well, I started out when I went to graduate school, it was in the 1990s. And at that time, there was a big hullabaloo around this new medication, Prozac, that everyone was saying, well, it doesn't just treat depression. They said that it's like a scalpel to the psyche, that it like allows you to sculpt your mind into being exactly what you want it to be. And there was a lot of, they called this cosmetic psychopharmacology. Cosmetic psychopharmacology, like getting a nose job, but except for your mind, right? And there was a lot of excitement about that. And I was skeptical, but I was really interested because it was one of those things like the big summer blockbuster movie that was just everywhere. Everyone was talking about Prozac. If you put Prozac in the title of your book, it was a bestseller. People were talking in that era's version of conversations like this about it. And so I became interested in this cultural phenomenon. Like, why are people so fascinated by this? Where do these utopian dreams of being able to just mold your mind so you get rid of all the stuff you don't like and become everything that you do like? Where did those come from? They didn't seem like medical visions to me, consumer culture, or even more like, drawing out of the deeper past, like the deals with the devil or the magician's nephew, things like where you're these fantasies of being able to suspend the rules of life and create this perfect situation. So I was interested in the ideas more than in the drugs. Like, I'm not a scientist, not a medicine, not a physician. So I was interested in the history of thinking these kinds of ways of thinking about people, like the idea that your mind is just a bunch of chemicals that you can alter and make it what you want it to. And so I wrote a cultural history of those medications. And I will say, you asked for a personal thing. A close friend of mine, a very close friend of mine in college, he was somebody who today we would say he had a panic disorder, but at the time he just was really struggling with incredibly intense, unpleasant feelings, and he tried all those medications, that they prescribed them all to him, and none of them worked. He used an older medication, one that they would have prescribed maybe in the 19th century, whiskey. And this was the way that he was able to manage his symptoms, I guess you would say. And in the back of my mind was he used to make fun of the advertisements for the medications that he was taking to help him deal with his situation. And I remember him kind of mocking them for their optimism, and they're like, oh, before and after, before if things are bad and now things are perfect, when none of them worked for him. And he didn't survive his difficulties with alcohol that came from that. And so in my mind was a skepticism, not about the drugs themselves so much. I know a lot of people are helped by them, but about the kinds of promises that were attached to those drugs, because they were so different. The people in the advertisements were so different from my friend. And so I was interested in like how that difference was produced, and why so many people believed it. We're all humans. Like, how many times have you encountered a situation that's just perfect with no costs, no downsides? It's not a very common thing. So it's raised my curiosity about how it came that so many people believed something that on its face seemed like self-evidently this is not likely to be true.
So, where did the intersection of medicine, addiction, and policy come into play? Like, how did you end up tying all of that together?
Yeah, well, so when I was researching this book on the cultural history of psychiatric medicines, um, it kind of led me in that direction in a couple of ways. Number one of the things that I noticed was that the United States is a pretty diverse country. There's all kinds of people who live here, right? But when people talked about Prozac, or when they talked about Valium, which is a really big mind drug before Prozac, or even earlier drug that very many fewer people have heard of, but it was really big in its day, Milltown in the 1950s. The only people that were talked about in the advertisements, in the articles, on the television and radio, it was as if the United States was just made up of white middle class people, and predominantly white middle class women. And it was so strange because they would talk about humans and their consciousness and what these drugs had to reveal. But then every single sentence and every single concept was like, Cheryl lives in the suburbs of, whatever, and she's got family with 3 kids and 2 cars. And so what I came to realize is that this whole cultural fascination, it wasn't an kind of American fascination. It was a particular fascination in white middle class America, which is a lot of people. Like, don't get me wrong, that's a lot of people. But they were fascinated by it for reasons particular to people living in their context. And that kind of clued me on to thinking, well, it's kind of interesting that in the media, like at that time, before the opioid crisis, if you read stories about addiction, I was talking in the 1990s, so you're probably reading about crack cocaine, and you would be reading about that as a story that takes place in poorer neighborhoods where people of color are living. And if you read stories about like Valium and Prozac, you're reading about, suburban neighborhoods where white middle class people are living. And I was like, well, these people get interested in drugs because they're a way to talk about other aspects of life in these communities, right? So that in that first book, some one wing of the second wave feminist movement, a white middle class wing, got really interested in Valium addiction. And they were basically saying, to make a really complex argument short, sexist medical system is shoveling pills at women who are unhappy because they had to give up their education and careers to mop floors and raise kids at home. And as a result, those women are getting addicted. And so they could tell stories of suburban housewives becoming so-called junkies, and that would attract public attention to a problem that they wanted to draw attention to. And so that was a story that really depended on it, where that drug use was taking place. And they made a big deal out of, well, these women never went to a street corner. These women never hung out with the wrong people. They're just nice ladies who went to their doctors. And that innocence was really a crucial part of the story. And by implication, there were other people who weren't innocent. That those other people were doing a different thing. And so that kind of clued me in that there were these kind of politics involved in really complicated ways in that story, and that drew me into thinking more broadly about how in the United States we work with these two sets of substances, legal medicines and illegal drugs, but they're often literally the same thing. And it's really an important question to ask, like how they come to be categorized that way, and what are the consequences for people on all the different sides, people, buying them as medicines, people buying them as drugs. And so that's how I got drawn into that.
But I know you spent, years digging through archives and court records and pharmaceutical market materials and patient stories or whatever. But was there a moment in your early research where you realized that this is just bigger than history, a history project? This is a pattern. This is a national pattern. Did that ever like click to
Yeah.
you by doing all that studying?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't in an archive when that click happened. I was out walking. I like to take a walk to just try to think through things. And I was walking, and I heard a news report. It was about 2006, 2007, about the opioid crisis. And the news reporter said something along the lines of, addiction is now like cropping up in places where it doesn't belong, like these white suburbs and these, cheerleaders and, football players or whatever. And I had just finished writing this book in which one of the chapters is about Valium addiction. And I was like, wait, Valium, like that whole thing happened in like 1979. So it's 2007. This is only like 25 years later. This is living memory. Like the people, the journalists, the people in the government, they were all alive in the 70s, right? They all saw that this was happening, that there was this huge addiction crisis taking place in white suburbs. So how can they say that this is this brand new thing? And so that's when I was like, wait a minute. And so then I went back to the archives and I was like, well, let me look and see, and then in the 70s, I was like, boy, the news was saying the same thing in the 70s, like, oh, addiction is popping up in places it doesn't belong. It used to be a ghetto thing and now it's a suburb thing. And I was like, but it's kind of eerie that they're saying the same things. I wonder if there was an earlier chapter of the same thing. So I went back, and sure enough, in the 1960s, in the 1950s, in the 1930s, I was like, how far is this going to go? In the 1910s, in the 1870s, there were newspaper reports saying, holy smokes, addiction is supposed to be for those city people who, the why we don't like them changed over time. Maybe they were Irish immigrants, or maybe they were, Russian immigrants, and then they become Black immigrants, and they become Latino immigrants. But they're always, that's where addiction is supposed to live. But it seemed, as far as I could tell, that almost all the time there was also a big crisis in the white suburbs, but they kept saying that it was new. And I'm a historian, right? And so I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, people are doing a lot of work to forget something that happened. And that's like waving a red flag in front of a historian. Like, we don't like to forget stuff. Our job is to remember stuff. And I'm like, well, I want to find out why there's all this work being done to try to forget this. And then to ask, why is it actually happening in the first place? And that's bigger than any particular history project. That's a broader, like you said, a national pattern.
So then that kind of segues back when you're talking about the suburban and separating the segments of society. So at what point did it go from the policy, the research to the human side of all this? Because you highlight a lot of that about the human side of addiction, and I guess we're taking safe medicine is what we want to call it. How did that weave now into the human side of it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an important point because mostly, like, I'm a policy historian. I'm talking about, which laws got passed and debates. But the reason why all that matters, of course, is the experiences of ordinary people. And, the story that we know a lot about are the people who began to take powerful opioids, in recent memory, powerful opioids because they were prescribed by a doctor, right? And then they aren't equipped with enough information to make smart choices about those pills. They don't know how dangerous they are. They don't know techniques for minimizing the chances that you'll develop an addiction. And so, a whole generation of Americans were exposed to these high risks of addiction. And we've seen the stories, we hear them, we all know somebody who's lived them. And that's a real tragedy. And one of the things that I have really tried to bear in mind is that nobody sets out to become addicted. Okay. Sure, the football player who hurt his back and takes opioid pills didn't set out to become addicted, but some guy who went to a party on the weekend and one of the things available at the party were pills, that guy didn't set out to become addicted either. Like everybody is innocent of the desire to become addicted to a drug, and everyone deserves empathy. Everyone who's ill, everyone who has an illness like addiction deserves empathy. And so one of the things that I try to think about is the condition, like many, many people encounter drugs in their lives, and almost everybody uses some drugs sometimes. Like beer at the end of the day, coffee in the morning, smoke cigarettes or vape. And the question is, which circumstances make that encounter more dangerous or safer, right? Because we know that most people pick the most addictive drug you want. Let's take heroin or cocaine. We know that about 75 or 80% of the people who use those drugs do not go on to become addicted. So that means to me, like, this is not an inevitability. It's not like you drop a hammer on your toe gets hurt. This is a situation in which policy decisions can have an impact on how dangerous this very common human behavior is. And when looking at individual stories, that helps us understand what kind of factors make this behavior, using drugs, make it dangerous, both for the person using them and for people who may be depending on them, as you would know a lot about in your situations.
So as you're navigating deeper and deeper in this, like, how does it begins to shape your empathy, towards this, you know, I
Yeah.
can't imagine, because when you're researching, you're digging some stories other than, the one like you shared about the personal side, but the ones that are not personal to you,
Yeah.
I'm sure you're just to keep encountering more and more and more.
Yeah, I get mad because fundamentally what I've come to believe over the course of doing this research. So I've looked at 150 years of American history, and I got a reasonable familiarity with the global history of alcohol and drugs. And one of the things that really sinks in is a what an ordinary human behavior it is to use a drug. So that, like, in some ways, after being exposed to a lot of these stories and reading all of these centuries of it, I lost my moral judgment of that behavior. And then when I think about it as like, this is a thing that, boy, people do this kind of thing. Then I look at all the ways that there seem to be forces working to try to make that very dangerous for people. So the story of pharmaceutical industry, they sell products that 80% of the profits come from 20% of the users. This is common across all kinds of commercial enterprises. It's not just a drug thing. But if you think about that logic, what it means is if a corporation is doing what it is kind of legally enjoined to do, right? They exist to maximize profits. They're not there to Like their founding documents and their legal responsibilities aren't to make the world a happy place, it's to make their investors money. And so if you follow that logic, forget about asking questions whether the people running the companies are good or bad or whatever. A company that sells potentially addictive products is obviously going to zero in on the people who are addicted because they're the 20% of the people that are going to make 80% of the profits. So you have a machine who you would have to be like, given those grounding elements, you would have to work really hard as a company to not try to encourage widespread addiction to your products. And I didn't ever see any evidence of almost any company anywhere, I'm sorry, saying, well, that's more important than profits. Instead, what you see is exactly the opposite. But that's just one of the stories. The other stories are from, essentially, I'm going to use a word to cover a huge range of people. I'm going to say politicians, but I don't just mean like people who try to get elected. I mean people who run advocacy organizations and who are pundits and cultural figures and everything who work on the other side of this issue. So I just talked about drug companies. They're on the pro-drug side. They're trying to sell drugs in dangerous ways because those dangerous ways help their bottom lines. On the other hand, the opposite side are people prosecuting a drug war in which in which many efforts seem to be made so that people who fall into trouble with drugs, their lives, instead of being supported and helped and reached out to with empathy and care, things are done to make it more difficult for them to be able to recover or survive from their experiences. And so this is, I'm not talking about things like trying to prevent people from drunk driving, which obviously, that is a kind of a specific behavior which we have a lot of evidence about. Like, I'm talking about things like I remember when they back, I think in the 90s was when they said, okay, you can't get financial aid to go to college if you have a drug infraction. And so there you have somebody who, you know, they engaged in a human behavior that history seems to show, like, I've tried, I have not found a society of any size where the people weren't availing themselves of psychoactive substances. So this is a kind of behavior that is dangerous, but it's not like morally laden. And then they get into some trouble, and then they're like, "Oh, well, now you're in trouble. We're trying to pull up the ladders, and because blaming you morally for your decisions." And then, you know, it's a little bit of a it's a little bit of a thought experiment, but a lot of the things that people with addiction experience that are bad, some of those come from the drug, and some of those come from the way we react to them, and that we make their circumstances more dangerous. So today, if you have an opioid addiction and you're buying on the street, you're very likely to have an overdose at some point or experience some other side effects from all this stuff that they're mixing into those drugs. And why is all that stuff there? It's there because on the one hand, it serves the smugglers' interests in some financial way, but it's also there because we have decided it's more important for those drugs to be entirely illegal than it is to try to prevent them from being adulterated in unsafe ways. So, I mean, I'm saying a lot of words here, but I guess that what those stories do to me as a policy historian, I think I get angry about the ways that we allow the harms of drugs to be magnified by our decisions as a society. Like, this could be a less harmful aspect of human life. It's never going to be perfect. The highways aren't perfect, but we do a lot to make driving on the highways safe. And it pisses me off that we don't do more to try to make this aspect of human life safe, ignoring thousands of years of evidence that we can't get rid of it. Like, if there was examples, if there was an example of like, oh, we might really succeed if we just do the right thing, maybe no one will use drugs anymore. since it isn't possible, it's really frustrating to me that there's so many casualties of bad actors, but also of well-intended actors who just have gotten caught up in the moral romance of drugs instead of thinking really practically about like like drug testing for people and who fly planes and drive cars. This is like practical. This is just like yeah, we need people fully functioning to be doing these jobs that people depend on, physicians, EMTs, things like that. But in that broader sense, we get sucked into the morality tales in ways that just make the harms worse. But you asked me about people, and I just went back to what I think about. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was sitting there in the back of my head. I was like, man, he you remind me of me, like you're just so passionate, like you can just see it. It's just
Yeah.
all over there. I was waiting on a tear to come out there, to like you, it's like you're just really, really passionate, and it made me reflect back to because you're saying the cycle, and I know you gave me some decades or whatever, but how far back are we actually talking? Like, how far did you go back, and what drugs were there
Mhm.
then that I because you see in the movies, right? They old Western movies, and it's like, oh, they're
Yeah.
high off opioids or whatever it is or whatever. So
Yeah.
how far back are we talking?
Yeah. So if we go back to, I mean, if you want to bring alcohol into the conversation,
Yeah, that's
uh,
fine.
yeah. So um, in America, you go back to the 1600s. Like alcohol is pretty interesting that so America was a colony, then a British colony, and there were these battles between the colonial local governments and the empire over alcohol licensing laws. Now, why is this? The empire wants strict licensing. They don't like people drinking. The locals are like, we're big in favor. We want to license lots of what they called them public houses back then. So that it would be like a combination of a hotel and a courthouse and a bar. And it was in a lot of smaller towns, it was the only public building in the town. Like you had your farmhouse or whatnot, and then the only public building was the public house. And like a judge would, when the judge came into town to hear cases, like once a month or whatever, this is where this would take place. And it was also where, people heard news and they would drink alcohol. The empire didn't like this because the British Empire is a hierarchical system. Like when we cross each other in the street, the person of a lower social station steps aside and takes off their hat. So there's these traditions of deference, and it's not a democracy in that sense. And when a bunch of guys get together at the public house and they do a lot of drinking, they're less likely to be intimidated by their superiors, less likely to behave in the way they're supposed to. And so what happened is that these public houses became early centers for resistance to British rule. And basically, a lot of the early militias, American militias, were, I mean, I say this a little tongue in cheek, but they were kind of like, how bars have like pool leagues where people play pool. They were kind of like that. They were attached to uh, public houses. And a lot of the signers, the Sons of Liberty, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, were actually bar owners because they were, they had risen up to leadership in these kind of informal groups. So alcohol, right after the Revolution, America has what you would call, I think, its first addiction epidemic. Alcohol drinking shoots through the roof because the revolution was kind of won by a bunch of bar brawlers in a lot of ways, and uh, and the drinking rates go up to a level that have never been seen since. And that's where you have the reaction was the temperance movement, these people who are a popular movement to get people to swear off alcohol and eventually to criminalize alcohol. And, in Prohibition in the 1920s, they finally succeeded, and alcohol was an illegal drug in the United States for, about 10, 15 years. So you can go back way back if you want.
Way back. So, well, the show is Origins, so
Okay. Yeah, okay.
so we go, trying to go back. But so alcohol probably is the first, right? You're saying
Yeah,
before drugs and
yeah. But then,
because
like, and you got to think about in the 19th century, this is before the germ theory of disease. People thought that illness was caused by changes in the inflow and outflow of the bodily humors or bad air called miasmas. And so you had a lot of disease. There were no painkillers, which means that surgery, uh, you know, the most important quality for a surgeon in the 19th century, in addition to an iron stomach, was was muscle, because you had to be able to basically saw through an arm or a leg before the person died of shock, and you had to do it really quick. And in that context, there was one drug that seemed to work for all different kinds of suffering. And this was a derivative of opium. Now, opium is just there's an opium poppy. It's a flower at the top, and there's a seed pod underneath it. And if you cut open the seed pod, this white goo comes out. That goo is opium. And that opium is chock full of things called alkaloids. And up until the like early 1800s, uh, people didn't know what alkaloids were. They didn't know why opium had the soothing powers that it did. But then this German chemist, Friedrich C. Turner, he succeeds in getting what he called the active principle of opium. And he called it morphine after Morpheus, the god of sleep.
right.
And morphine becomes available in the 19th century. So remember what I said, they can't cure any disease. They can't perform any surgery that isn't like brute, gross, like cutting off arms and stuff. So they can't do any dental work because there's no painkillers. And into this situation, you bring a drug that eases pain, that helps people sleep, that just has magic properties. And by the way, it constipates you. And one of the biggest killers of the 19th century was cholera. Turns out morphine can save you from cholera because, it prevents you from losing all of your water through diarrhea. So you can imagine morphine becomes incredibly prized. Physicians, they call it Saint Morphine. Saint Morphine. And the hypodermic needles invented in middle of the century, just before the Civil War.
Okay.
And, every doctor has morphine and the hypodermic in their little black bag. And after the war, when you have mass production is invented and implemented in all kinds of things, it's true also for morphine and the hypodermic. And so it goes everywhere. And in the late 19th century, there's a huge, huge rise in addiction to opioids. When I started teaching, I could say it's never been that high ever again. Now, sadly, that's no longer true. But it was a huge crisis at that time because people knew that opium could be, at that time, they would say opium could produce a habit, or they could say people became enslaved to opium. But they thought morphine was different because morphine was a scientific product. Like opium was this thing, was this plant. It was kind of like a witch doctor's thing. But when you applied science to it, you got this thing called morphine. That one was going to be fine. And it took them for quite a while to accept that morphine was not only created a habit, but created a habit more intensely than opium. Didn't become widely accepted until the 1880s or even 1890s.
And I was trying to scroll through my phone because I can't remember the name of this movie for the life of me. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday with Russell, with the Val Kilmer, the Western,
Yeah.
and I'm sitting there trying to look it up, and I can't remember it, but it's drawn me to a scene um that was in that movie, and I was trying to find the name of it so my listeners be like, oh yeah, that movie. Uh,
Mhm.
but they were uh anyway, so in the scene there was particular scenes where um Wyatt Earp's wife was she kept drinking something out of the bottle, and
Mm.
it's like, oh, it's medicine, right? It's medicine. But she, throughout the movie, she kept relying on that medicine, which ultimately became this probably what you were saying, this liquid drug. And I never really paid attention to it till I started
Mm.
talking about with my substance abuse counselors or whatever. And that movie now comes back,
Yeah.
um, you know, to me about like it goes so far back, with
Mhm.
that. I don't know if it was the opioids or a liquid version of something, even back then.
Yeah,
But I
what she was drinking
can't
would have been laudanum, which was,
laudanum. That's what
yeah,
that's
it's
yeah.
opiate dissolved in alcohol.
Okay. So that's what that was.
Yeah.
And I Tombstone. Movie was Tombstone.
Ah, yeah, that's right.
I
Yeah,
could
well,
not
so I mean, and that's true. Like they didn't have a lot to do to help people with the kind of like people labor with their bodies then. So you had lots of chronic injuries. Um, you had the trauma of pain and war. Yeah, that those medications were really prized and really dangerous.
yeah, and I could not remember the name of that movie for that. So if we move forward to you write about race, class, and respectability, as its shape was to protect and but now it's to punish, I guess. Um, but when did you first notice that through your history of addiction that it was more of not really equality, but also a history of inequality? I know you talked about the
Yeah.
suburbs and if you go back to the war on drugs in the inner city and so forth and so on. Um, I guess
Mhm.
my question to you would be, why does the narrative surrounding around the drugs and the way they're handled and navigated through different races, why is it always just black and white?
Yeah.
Like, it's never any other races, is always a black and white thing. Like, why is that always
Mhm.
a forefront in the addiction conversation? And
Yeah. That's a deep that's a deep one. You know, I can answer it in a few different ways because this is one of these things like I as I was having lunch with a historian of different topics, and he was like, "Man, why are you always talking about race? You're just always and like what?" And I was like, "It just hits you over the head. Like I didn't set out. I wasn't trained in the history of race in America. I just was looking at the archives, and I was like, damn, this is just an obsession in this area." And so asking why is, I think, really central to it. And one thing I can say, first off, is that there have been times when there have been other races involved in the question. So, for example, with opium, opium was connected to Chinese immigrants in the late 19th century. So, I think I can tell this story super quickly, but in the middle of the 19th century, one of the big profit centers for the British Empire was they had plantations in colonial India, and then they smuggled opium into China, where it was illegal for them to do that. But they did that, and that was one of the ways they made money. And they fought a couple of wars, the Opium Wars, to prevent the Chinese government from putting an end to this smuggling operation. And then there was this huge wave of migration from China during the period during and after those wars, people looking for work, Chinese men, and they were coming from a place where opium smoking was near universal, in part because they'd just been flooded by these by British smuggling. And then when those workers arrived in the U.S., primarily in the West Coast, there were a lot of native-born folks who were very unhappy about that because they would work for lower wages. They were a different race. They were practice alien religions, things of this sort, and they were trying to find reasons to make the argument we shouldn't allow these people to live here. And one of the biggest arguments that they made is these people are bringing in smoking opium and they're luring white women into their opium dens where they're enslaving them to opium and then like turning them into sex workers, basically. That was a big argument and it was incredibly successful. immigration from China was outlawed in 1882, and the first immigration restriction in American history. And so the point being there that you're right, that it is overwhelmingly black and white. But for a historian who's, looked in all the nooks and crannies of it, there are examples of others too. Um, but then, it's a real challenge to me because let me just give the bird's eye view from 10,000 feet. What I see is that for a lot of different reasons that we can talk about, um, the divisions between medicines and drugs, which are often the same substance, but they become really different things in our lives, that those are the kind of the logic separating them out often tends to hinge on race. So that like the things that are medicines are the things that white people are using, and the things that are drugs are the things that people of color are using. And even if it's literally the same substance. And so, and from 10,000 feet, what I see is that everybody is harmed by this, right? I see that white people are being sold medications and told that they're totally safe when they're not. And so you get things like the opioid crisis or the Valium crisis or the morphine crisis in the late 19th century. But this isn't opium. It's not like what those Chinese people are doing. You can just use this morphine all you want, right? So, but on the other hand, the people who aren't able to buy the medicines, who are buying the drugs, they're getting lower quality products that are much more dangerous. And then when they run into trouble, instead of being met with empathy and support and care, they're met with judgment and like, you're a bad person. I'm scared of you and I need to like reject you. And so from like 10,000 feet, I could ask the question, well, why would anybody do this? Like who's actually benefiting from separating these things out? Like race doesn't seem to matter at all with drugs. Like it's completely irrelevant. So why did it become so central to the way that we govern drugs? If drugs themselves, they just interact with human brains and people, like race doesn't even factor in. Why did it become so important? And that's the $64,000 question. And it what has to do with, I mean, here I can only move into to theorizing, because it's not like the archive holds a document of like some original drug policy person who was like, I'm going to do this thing. That isn't how humans work. But it seems to me that one of the things that frightened authorities about drugs is their ability to foster sociability. So, you drink together in a saloon, you smoke opium together in a den, in all these ways, people use drugs in sociable settings. And one of the things that drugs makes possible is comfort between people who otherwise wouldn't be comfortable together. Like, you're rich and you're poor, and you talk different ways and you have different experiences, and you're going to be stepping on each other's emotional toes all the time, saying things that are offensive. But then, when you have a couple drinks together, you can relax and you can connect as human to human. And I think about that TV show Succession. I don't know if you saw that one about the media empire. One of the kids of the super rich media mogul, he's got a drug problem, and he super rich kid of privilege. And at one point, his drug problem kind of goes out of control, and he's hanging with a bunch of like guys in a trailer home, and they're like, it's one of the only scenes in the entire movie where the people seem to like each other, and they're actually having conversations that you're like, oh, this, and there's something about the way that drugs invite people to step outside of their social containers. And one reality is that one of the things you see in American history is a huge investment in trying to separate people out, coming from a lot of different ways to try to not just make people mentally suspicious of each other, but to make sure they live in different places and they never go to the same place together. And that, and for a long time, the most tightly policed of all these boundaries was the sexual boundary, that white women were were understood as crucial to the propagation of the white race, that they were the ones who had to have white babies. And I say this now, it sounds like I'm a total crackpot, but if you go back to like 1873, this is just what they said. You know what I mean? Like it's just right there. Um, and they were not they were perfectly proud of their of what me today looking at them like, well, that's textbook racism. They were not like, oh, I'm embarrassed by being a racist. No, they were like, this is what I care about, and this is the side of the angels or whatever. And so I think that that drugs then get kind of drawn into that effort to keep people separate because drugs seem to pose a threat to that, both because of the way people use them, sociable, and a lot of them, the most frightening things that anti-drug warriors have said over the years is like you see you see uh, cross-racial mixing in settings where drugs are used, whether it's white women going to opium dens or white girls in the 50s going to smoke reefer with vipers in the jazz joints or whatever. And and so I think it gets caught up in that, and it's a big distraction from thinking in a hard-headed way about like what are the dangers of drugs? What how can we protect people from the kinds of harms that can come to people when they use drugs uh, in ignorance, in difficult situations, surrounded by people who are, going to reject them if they have problems. Like, and so instead of thinking about like in real hard-headed ways, like I just don't want my kids to suffer those things. I don't care about irrelevant issues. What I care about is how to keep people safe. And it's been a huge long-running distraction, is the way that race gets mixed in with that. And if you're talking about race in America, there's only one group of people who were enslaved for hundreds of years and had this deep, like DNA level impact on the US that we're still struggling with the long after effects of. And so if you're going to talk about race, black and white is going to be central in America. I hope not forever, but it's not surprising just for a historian who looked at that stuff, it's because it's everywhere.
So and I guess after doing all these things, kind of leads me to, my next question is that many scholars kind of avoid corporate wrongdoing,
Mm.
conversations or regulatory failures and human suffering, right? So what made you lean towards this uncomfortable truth rather than run away from it? And my point to that is that what led you to your book Whiteout and white market drugs,
Mhm.
that theology, that theory, or that thought process led to those books? And if so, tell us about those books.
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't start out, I mean, in the nerdiest possible way. Like, if you can't tell that I'm a nerd from having talked to me from now, you know it now. But like, I was just so interested in the story of Prozac. I didn't go into it thinking that much about drug companies at all. But then, when you look at it, the bad behavior is so visible and bad that it kind of smacks you in the face. And that's one of the things I think maybe people don't understand about scholars like me, historians like me, and I think people don't understand it because I have to teach students it all the time, is that like we're just there to uncover what is, like if you go into a project thinking, oh, I'm gonna say this thing like that I believe, and then you find stuff that points in the other direction, you just have to go in another direction. Or if you're like, boy, I really think this is true, but my evidence is kind of weak, what you got to do is you just have to write, the evidence is weak for this, but this is kind of what I think, like that our goal is to be transparent. We're not trying to win, we're trying to understand. And that means sometimes you have to change your thinking when you get exposed to evidence. And that's, the good part of that is you can't lose as a scholar. Like whatever you find, you found something. You can't ever be being wrong is one of the best things that can happen to a scholar because then you learn and you become more right. So I didn't start out thinking that I was going to be saying anything particular about drug companies, but then it became evident that of all the people involved in the national conversation about these substances, like they were really loud. Right? They had a big bullhorn. Um, and then I started to think about it, you know, when I started to think about what I call white market drugs, so those are the pharmaceuticals, the legal stuff, versus illicit market drugs. And when I started to think about those as like different ways of organizing the same basic products and behavior, they're both places where you have large commercial enterprises who are motivated to sell as much as they can, and they don't seem to care that much about their consumers' health. They seem to care about moving a lot of product. And when I thought about them as kind of different, just two different markets that are organized according to different rules, leading to the people who sell in those markets to engage in different behaviors because they're responding to market incentives. So, like we might think about fentanyl dealers as evil, but they're also like what they're trying to do is make money. They're not trying to kill people, they're trying to make money, and they're making money the way that the market allows them to make money. And that means they're making decisions. We produce the incentives and then they just respond to them. So in thinking about this, it did really zero me in on corporate misbehavior. And that's what white market drugs, it's really hard to find the records of big companies because they fully understand just how bad that would be. If you look at the tobacco industry litigation, like everything was going great until a court case forced them to fork over their archival documents. And then the stuff in those archives was like, it'll drop your jaw, how direct they were about their project of addicting children to their product so they can make a lot of money. Crazy. So corporations they don't set up archives and let you go look at their documents and stuff. But luckily, over the course of time, those documents, you can find ways to encounter them coming at it through a side door or from court cases where they got subpoenaed or congressional testimony that where they can get subpoenaed. And so I say the pharmaceutical industry is I guess my metaphor is, let's say you're trapped in the North Pole, it's cold, you have a sled and you need to get to a town for food and warmth, and the only thing you have to pull the sled is a leopard. So is that leopard dangerous and like maybe wants to eat you? Yeah. But do you need it? Yeah, you do, because otherwise you're not going to get where you need to go. So I think the pharmaceutical industry is like it's a it's a creature whose agenda only overlaps in small ways with ours, and you have to be aware of what it is, but you can't just throw it away. Like I'm sorry, some people, like a lot of people, because I study pharmaceutical industry and I've said some pretty harsh things about them, and I was an expert witness against the pharmaceutical industry and the opioid litigation. They want to kind of induct me onto a team of like big pharma is just evil and we should like get herbal remedies instead or something. And I'm like, I'm completely not on board with that. The medicines that they make are life-saving. We all know multiple people whose lives have been saved by them. Doesn't mean that they're angels, but it's just more complicated than just simple like good and evil. And also those herbal companies are huge corporations too. And for better or for worse, we know a lot about what's wrong with the pharmaceutical industry, allowing us to protect ourselves, allowing us to, if we have the right politicians in power, to implement regulations that are really specifically can target the stuff that we know they're doing that's bad. Some of these other places, we don't even know that. The herbal industry, alternative medicine industry, we basically know nothing. So how do we even start? And not to mention things like the businesses we call cartels, that are another business enterprise. So, I think about the pharmaceutical industry and the medical system, it's like the least worst. yeah, it's got problems. But if you are trying to tell me to just like kick them to the curb and go with some like herbal person instead, then I'm going to say like you're actually trying to sell me something, right? That you
Right.
are that I am I'm as suspicious of you as I am of everybody else. So I kind of wandered away from your question, man. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine because it actually led to, because they just lead to other things that just pops up. So as you say that start having you reflect on like you're trying to sell me something or you're trying to do this. So how has this work shaped your own relationship with prescription drugs, healthcare, and the medical system, your friends, family, other people around you? Because you seem like a
Mhm.
very strong advocate for certain things. So how has that shaped everybody
Yeah,
around you relationship with the healthcare system and prescription drugs?
yeah. I mean, to me, I think of the healthcare system and prescription drugs are like heavy machinery. It's like a bulldozer. Sorry, I got all these metaphors. It's a leopard. No, it's a
It's
bulldozer. But the whole thing, is like a bulldozer. And when you bring in a bulldozer to your property to get a job done, like that's a major, major undertaking. A lot of it's not there are going to be a lot of things that are affected by bringing in a bulldozer. But sometimes you need a bulldozer. Sometimes that's a job you have, but you do not want to call in the bulldozer to plant your daisies in the front yard. And so to me, when I interact with the medical system or the pharmaceutical industry, or if somebody asks me like, if they for some reason think a historian would have something smart to say about this, what I say is like you just need to be really careful. Not in a moralistic like I'm gonna enter the devil's den and negotiate with evil, but in the sense of this is a really big machine that's designed to do certain things, and sometimes you want those things done, and it's going to be really important for you at those moments to say yes, to say, yeah, I will take the Prozac or I will take the buprenorphine or whatever it is. And then there's other times when that machine is not appropriate to the job you want done. It's too big, or it's the kind of destruction, like when the bulldozer comes over your yard, it's going to do too much harm, more harm than the good that it does. And that what what I think is really helpful is to think in really pragmatic terms about this. People in the drug industry are not worse than the people in any other industry. Or in anywhere else, that these are people responding to incentives. They they see themselves as the heroes of their own story. They are trying to do things that they believe are good. It doesn't mean they're always going to be good for you in any particular situation. So I'm skeptical, even to the level I'll say I'll give an example from my own personal history. In the 1970s, I was living in Arkansas. I was born in 1970, and uh, the school wanted me diagnosed with, at the time they just called it hyperactivity, but today it would be ADHD. And and my parents at that time made the decision. I didn't know about this for a long, long time, but they made the decision of like, well, David's a real pain in the ass, and sure would be nice if he didn't like act like that. But instead of trying to do something about that, we're just gonna kind of resign ourselves that he's going to be suspended a lot and he's going to be in trouble a lot because he's just a rambunctious kid. And um, and then when I think back on it, like I think a diagnosis is a really important part of that machinery. Like you are bringing the bulldozer in, and if you really need it, then a diagnosis can be incredibly helpful. But if you like, I respect their decision of saying, you know what, I think we can handle this, so let's just see. You know what I mean? Like maybe if it hadn't worked, if I my behavior had gotten out of control or something, then maybe they would have brought in the bulldozer. But even at that level, it's worth just thinking, do I want to start that big process? But so I'm like, on the one hand, very skeptical. I know some of these folks. I've seen their stories in the archives. These are not, you don't want to blindly trust these people. But on the other hand, know to say yes. They are also people with a ton of knowledge who are trying in their own way to do useful and good things in the world. And there's a whole bunch of medicines that and medical interventions that are really effective. And so it's a question of not like, do I accept it or reject it? Am I afraid of it, or am I just going to do whatever it says? It's a question of really um, thinking about when your circumstances are such that you're ready to let in the bulldozer, and to recognize that those things do happen to all of us. Sometimes you're going to need the bulldozer.
So is there parallels between the 20th century wonder drugs and today's pharmaceutical market of stimulants and painkillers and whatnot?
I mean, on the one hand, yeah, the same three classes of drugs have been widely available for since the late 19th century. That's stimulants. So cocaine was derived from the coca leaf in 1883, and amphetamine was put into circulation in the 1930s. So stimulants have been around for a long time. And you got sedatives. Those are things like alcohol, but also barbiturates, sleeping pills, and things like Valium and Xanax and Klonopin. And then you got your opioids. So those have been consistent. Some every once in a while, drug companies are like, oh, we brought a new stimulant and this one isn't addictive, or we have a new, but in those three classes, from a bird's eye view, they're all very similar. The one thing that's new in the 21st century is these drugs that fall under the category of psychedelics. And there's a whole bunch of different ones. And it's not totally clear what's going to happen with those. Like from my perspective as a historian, the most incredible thing about them is the amount of money that's being invested in them. And I'm going to include cannabis here just because I don't know about where you live, but like I know where there are 3 cannabis dispensaries just in my neighborhood, which is pretty shocking. And it speaks to like the level of that we're investing as a society in making this kind of drug available to people. Same with and psychedelics, they're in some ways building towards that too. So like that's new. And there isn't a lot of historical precedent for those drugs being available at the scale they are today. And there is precedent for big companies who know that they get 80% of their profits from 20% of the users selling stuff, selling psychoactive stuff. And that makes me nervous. I don't have anything against weed or psychedelics, whatever they seem like. Just like all the drugs, they do some things that are good and they do some things that are bad. I'm a little skeptical that the best way to circulate those kinds of products in society is to tell a company to try to sell as much of them as they can, which seems completely bonkers to me, as just basic rule of the road.
So written that white market drugs were often more dangerous than the illegal counterparts. Why did policymakers ignore this evidence?
Well, they they ended up causing more harm. I think that on balance, I would say that they're actually safer, if only because their FDA inspectors go into the factories where they're made. Like if you buy a prescription drug and it says it's alprazolam, Xanax, that's what's in the bottle. And in that way, they're safer. But then if they're safer, well, how did they become more dangerous? How did they cause more harm? And that's because of what you just said, that authorities, with some regularity over history, like there are periods of time where they ignore those dangers. And while there's specific historical configurations at each moment, there are some commonalities, which is that it tends to be a time when there's a long tussle in American history. You have periods where people are like, man, corporations have gone out of control. Like we need the government to step in and like regulate what they're selling. That we had late 19th century, we had like workers falling into the vats where they were making sausage and people were eating the workers. Like that ain't cool. We need to empower the state to regulate corporations. And then you have other periods where it's like, man, I can't take a step without filling out 18 forms. We need to liberate businesses to like innovate. And American history kind of goes back and forth between these political uh, attitudes. And during the attitudes where businesses are seen as like um, places with all the answers, that's when you have regulators being like, well, they say that OxyContin isn't as addictive, and we do need a problem for like we do really have a pain epidemic. And it's the 1980s, Reagan is in power. He's saying government's the problem, business is the solution. Here's a business with a solution. Maybe we should let them give it a try. So that's one thing that happens in there. It also weirdly is very common that when you have a boom in sales of white market drugs, it comes right after a big crisis in illegal market drugs. It's a complicated story, but like, let me just give the example of OxyContin. That came right after the crack cocaine episode, right? And so, in a lot of people's minds, and not just in everyday people, but in a lot of policymakers' minds, a lot of physicians' minds, a lot of people who thought about this stuff a lot, in their minds, addiction became something that happened to poor Black people in cities. And so that helped them when they heard a company saying, well, we're going to be selling, opioid medication to coal miners in West Virginia. And they're not like that. They're not going to have the same problems as these stigmatized groups in cities. So this medicine will be safe. So you had that combination of the two things, like this belief in the goodness of corporations, which is, one of these cyclical things in American history, combined with a recent historical lesson that made a lot of otherwise smart people think, well, maybe white people just don't get addicted to stuff because they're like special white goodness or whatever it is, things that don't exist, right? Anybody and a drug it doesn't care what your race is. But so those two things together lead regulators to say, okay, well, let's take a foot off the gas, let this product circulate and see what happens. And, the same thing always happens. It's never good.
So I have a question that talks about, like what did early drug testing policies get wrong, about
Mm.
legal substances, and how did this mistake, um, kind of shape the modern testing panel, right? So like the Department of Transportation testing panels is marijuana, cocaine, PCP, opioids, and amphetamines. That's the five drugs that we test under for federal. So what did we get it wrong, or about these
Mm.
legal substances?
And that's a good question. I'm just going to say right out front that I strongly suspect that you know a lot more than I do about this. So I'm going to stick to what I know, and then maybe you can fill in, and help me
Gotcha.
out because this is definitely your area of expertise. Um, one of the things is that in the history of medicine, like broad-based testing uh, systems for anything, like for tuberculosis, something like that. They have all these kinds of unexpected uh, outcomes, unintended consequences. Same thing for like testing for cholesterol or testing for breast cancer. And so one of the debates within the medical community is like, at what point do you want to implement a really broad-based test for an illness? And so that's one of the things, even before you get down to picking which drug, like that question is really um, one of the places where these things can go wrong, just in terms of like testing people who may not have a problem and may be doing their jobs fine because whatever it is, like them smoking weed on the weekend doesn't affect their ability to serve burgers at McDonald's or whatever. And then suddenly, like that becoming a problem, like that person whose life was fine being tested and now their life isn't fine anymore. And nobody wants that. The goal is to protect people, who are using or in danger of using drugs in a dangerous way, and the people who may be put at risk by virtue of what they do for their job. Um, So uh, I think that we the most likely places where you would see problems with testing regimens is testing the wrong people at the wrong times and missing people who you might really want to test. Like, I don't know if members of Congress, you could probably tell me, but like, do those guys get tested? I might think, they got all of our lives in their hands. Maybe they'd be one of those people that you want, really thinking sharp. But
Well, in my space is more of, the type of position that they determine is safety critical, right? So,
yeah.
it's very obvious with the Department of Transportation, rail, train, those are very obvious mechanics. However, on the federal side is more of access, you
Mm.
know, and who they determine who would be in a testing designated position based on
Mhm.
security clearance or access and, things
Mhm.
of that nature. Um, but anybody that is a government employee that swears in under the oath of office is subject to, meeting one of those testing designated categories. But elected officials are not. So,
I guess that's not a surprise given what we know about
yeah.
many of them.
So, and I'm kind of winding down, but I have so many good questions there. But in your research, how did pharmaceutical companies manipulate scientific research to hide the addictive potential of their products? I think a lot of people like, well, if we know all of these things, then why is it still allowed?
Yeah. I think we can say that, so scholars will call this knowledge production. Like there are systems that produce knowledge. So I'm a little cog in this. I do research in archives and I publish things. So I'm part of a system of knowledge production. And one of the things that we really want to produce knowledge about is medical interventions. Do they work? Are they safe? What kind of people do they work for? What kind of people are they safe for? What are the dangers? How do you mitigate them? Like that's really important in our society. And one of the things that's been a very long-running dilemma in America in particular, because we've always been a super commercial and capitalist society, has been how do you produce kind of unbiased knowledge about these things when somebody's going to make a lot of money or lose a lot of money based on whatever you say. And there's been a lot of different models for how to do that. Back in the late 19th century, for example, they said you can't patent anything therapeutic. You can't patent a medicine. You can't patent a treatment. They call themselves men of science. You can't have secret ingredients. You can't have secrets. Like our whole goal is to advance this. So whatever you discover, you share right away. Everybody benefits. Nobody's making a lot of money from that. But, you know, one of the problems with this is that it didn't provide an incentive to discover new stuff. There was no appeal to the base instincts of like, I want glory and I want money. And so this slowly evolved into the patent system where there's huge amounts of riches are going to be determined by does that drug trial show success or not. And what that meant is that, you and I, we're people with jobs. We spend our day doing our jobs. Pharmaceutical industry has uncounted people, probably smarter than both of us put together, whose job it is to figure out how to game that system. And there's been some great, I guess there are maybe pharmaceutical anthropologists who study the way that knowledge gets made. And it's incredible how they've come up with ways to um, pervert the production of knowledge so that that production of knowledge becomes a kind of marketing. So it's not like, well, here's science, and then you got to spin the science with your marketing. It's like the marketing team is there in the room when the science is first discussed, right? And the marketers are there at every step of the way so that every decision about what to test the drug for, about who to test it in, about how to set the parameters of the study. So who's included in the study, who's excluded? How do you define successful outcome? And then when the study's done, how do you publish it? How do you write the data up in a way that looks in a particular way? And in all of those steps, that process has become profoundly corrupted. Again, it doesn't mean that no drugs work. It means that we have a really hard time uh, being able to just have faith in a particular source of information. That we have to. This is a we have to spend more time on our own trying to figure out what information to trust than we ought to. In a complicated society like ours, we have divisions of labor. I agree not to design car engines, and the guy who sells cars agrees not to write books about the 1870s. So we specialize in stuff. And what's happened here is in an area where it's really important that we have specialized expertise developing information about whether, for example, drugs work or not, or what their dangers are, like we've allowed that process to become corrupted in a way that we can't just trust them to do that work. Instead, we have to spend our precious time in our lives when we've got other jobs and we don't have expertise in it to figure it out. And this is where, you get some of the kookier, frankly, critiques of the pharmaceutical industry, because once you let go of expertise, like, where are you? You're like, oh, my neighbor's cousin's dog found a thing and that, and it really worked for me. And you're like, that's no way to run a healthcare system. Like I
Social
no
media.
respect for your cousin's dog, but um, we need serious people answering these questions and ones that aren't on the take from the industry.
Right. Man, I don't know where to go because I got a couple more and that are kind of important to me. And I think one of them is that like you've shown that the addiction epidemics keeps repeating every few decades, right? So what structural failures that we have now that's going to guarantee these cycles that could continue to repeat?
Well, that's a cheerful question. Um, uh, you know, I think that fundamentally, the deepest issue is the way that we divide up people who buy and sell drugs into good guys and bad guys. And that what that means is that um, so I'm a little bit of an optimist. I may not sound like it, but one of the reasons why I study legal drugs instead of illegal drugs is I'm like, I haven't seen a lot of policy creativity in illegal drugs. I haven't seen a lot of stuff like that works. And I'm like, oh, there's a good historical precedent. You can learn from the past because look at that thing that worked. There's not a lot of creativity, not a lot of like, we really want to solve this problem. There's just a lot of like, shouting and blowing up boats and who knows what. But in the legal side, serious people have thought, you know what? A lot of people should use opioids because they're a good medicine. How can we do that safely? Or I think people like need to use a sedative because stress and anxiety are harmful to people. How can we do it safely? They do it wrong a lot, but there are sometimes that they do it right. And one of the things that's frustrating to me as a historian is I've identified a few places in the past where the US like had a pretty good approach and it worked reasonably well. But because it was only in the medical markets, what happened was policymakers were like, instead of saying, well, those are really successful policies, excellent, they had a tendency to say, well, those were good people, those, white suburban people, they were just like, they only got addicted by accident. They weren't like deeply flawed. And so we were able to help them out. And so they didn't take the policies that worked and then kind of just use them more generally for everybody because they didn't have the imagination to be able to say, well, maybe humans are just humans and something that works, like an approach that works for people might work for other people too. And so I think like in the most recent thing, we had the opioid crisis that started out in a lot of very um, white areas of the United States. They got a lot of sympathy and empathy from public officials who had been like more or less drug warriors, suddenly like discovered when it was their cousin or their neighbor or something. They were like, wait, this is really an illness, not a, we really need to develop a different approach. So there was a lot of policy creativity. And then now as the crisis is shifting and it's different demographics of people who are most impacted, history would predict that we're not going to keep doing those effective policies, that instead we're just going to lose our patience and just say we should lock everybody up. I hope that won't happen. But if it was, you asked what are the failures now that will make sure this happens again in the future, that would be it. Because drug crises don't stay in one place. They travel and everybody ends up paying the cost for them. And so if you don't use effective policies in one place, you can just be damn sure that eventually everyone is going to pay the price for that. Um, and so I would, at the deepest level, that's what I would say.
So after your studies of all these years of legal drugs, what warning would you give policymaker, regulators, and the public today?
Yeah, I like to say make drugs boring. That there are real practical. I mean, you must encounter this all the time in your work. That like really practical issues that you can solve by hard-headed, pragmatic thinking. I just say don't get seduced into any of the kind of crazy stories that we like to tell about drugs that are really more about like. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, this may sound harsh, but I feel like a lot of reporting on drugs is really like a way to try to sneak something very similar to pornography into regular news reporting. Like they want prurient stories about cheerleaders who turn into sex workers, or that these kinds of things they're there to titillate, they're there to sensationalize. And what they do is they prevent us from thinking in a hard-headed, pragmatic way about drugs. And to me, the hard-headed, pragmatic thing is number one, lots of human history, you don't have a drug-free society. But number two, we which drugs people use and how they use them varies really widely. Those are things that we can control. So we can't stop people from using drugs, but we could stop people from using fentanyl. Nobody used fentanyl like 30 years ago. You know what I mean? It's not a human nature to use fentanyl. Our policies unintentionally incentivized people who sold heroin to switch to selling fentanyl. So we can be pragmatic. One of the ways that I say, no politician should ever listen to an academic, and one of the ways that I make sure that people are aware of this is I say, what would be a huge public health success um, is if we trended backwards from fentanyl to heroin and from heroin to smoking opium, which used to be the illegal form of opium that got used, because smoking opium is so much safer. And you can have some people you can use opioids. There really isn't a better one that they could use than that. So why is our policy made it so that we have no smoking opium, but we have tons of fentanyl, which is like 300 times as dangerous? People who want to use opioids, they didn't like get as a 15-year-old say, well, I'd rather use fentanyl than opium. No, they just bought what was available to them. So, okay, just to get back to that second way, just be pragmatic. Don't get lured into thinking in sensationalized romantic ways about drugs. It's a problem like highway accidents. Just like, work the problem. Don't get distracted with stories of sex and race and morality and all this stuff. Just work the problem. That's what I'd say.
So then, what would you think is the biggest myth that Americans still have about prescription and addiction?
Yeah, man. These days I wonder if people are overly frightened of prescription drugs, because they just had that beaten over their heads, this thing that happened. And one of the most common questions that I get asked by friends and family members is like, my doctor prescribed me this drug. Should I take it? Or I don't want to take it, or this is just bullshit, right? I shouldn't do that because they're just in the pocket of Big Pharma or whatever. And I'm like, wait, you know, they're even the drugs that you are most afraid of are really valuable, like OxyContin. It's a
Right.
really valuable drug. Like the question is when and where. So don't start, so I think sometimes in some ways people might, some of the misconceptions they might have now is that like it's inevitable. Oh, you had tooth surgery. If you take that opioid, you're doomed. Uh, You know, it's complicated, but it's not. Uh, we need these medications.
So my last thing for you will be the last thing for them. What would you like to leave to the listening audience?
Wow. Well, if you're, as a historian, I could say after an hour and a half, if you're still awake, one thing, good for you. Like, well done, respect. Um, and I guess I would say, be hopeful. This is a problem that we can solve. Like, we can't solve human problems. Like, we're all going to die one day. We're all going to be sick, have heartbreak, whatever. We can't solve it in that utopian sense. But we can solve it in the sense that it's not a crisis anymore. We can do it. And it's not even that hard in terms of what the policies are. It's a heavy political lift, but I just say, don't give in to a feeling of doom about it or fatalism because um, you know, this doesn't have drugs don't have to be a part of life that makes people shiver and shake and think they're dealing with demons. Like it could be a part of life like that we tame so that it is not very dangerous, much like moving at 65 miles an hour would be terrifying to in most circumstances, but we found ways to make that all right.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you being on. I know we went longer than intended, but it was just great conversation. Um,
It's a
and
nice way to say I talk too much. I appreciate that.
no, I love it. I would have been cut it off if that was the case, but no, I enjoyed it. Um, have you on. So if people can reach out to you for further questions, or if they want to enroll in your courses at University of Buffalo, like how would people further get in contact with you if they want to reach out to you to speak or anything?
Yeah, if you just Google my name, David Herzberg, I've got a website and the university has a website. And in terms of enrolling in the courses, I don't teach, I don't have any one of those like MOOCs, what do you call them? The ones that are just available online. But folks who live in the area, senior auditors are always welcome in the class. And I'm always happy to talk about these things with anybody who thinks that a historical perspective will be useful for them and in what they're trying to accomplish. Always happy to talk.
Awesome. And I'll put it in the description box for those who want to reach out. Again, everybody, thanks for tuning in to Everything Drug and Alcohol and had such a wonderful conversation. And be on the lookout for the other opiate origins that are to come for this series. So again, thank you, everybody. And as always, I'll say you'll know something is right for you because when it comes along, it'll complement you, not complicate you. So until then, everybody, take care.